I think we're all in agreement that we've outgrown the European-based paradigm of historical development that we inherited from thinkers, from Marx to Huntington. We're not going to accept the transition from feudalism to capitalism to industrial transformation as something normal and then try to diagnose why other regions have deviated from that. What does growing out of this paradigm really mean? We still need some kind of periodization, and we still need some kind of heuristic structure for explaining how we got from then to now. We could start with the observation that Europe, used in these particular paradigms, is a myth. Whether we're talking about population increase or urbanization or per capita GDP between about 1500 and 1820, what we see in England and Belgium and the Netherlands is this one tiny group of nations with rising wealth and urbanization. And the rest of Europe is at levels that are closer, and I'm not saying they're identical, I'm just saying they're closer to Turkey or Russia or China than they are to England, Belgium, or the Netherlands. We don't have a very handy way of referring to that tiny little group. I suppose we could call it something like temperate northwestern Europe. But one way or another, we're still attributing to Europe the characteristics of these sort of fringe nations, and then from that we build this paradigm of development, and then from that we generate this mirage that supposedly characterizes the differing rates of development between two distinct entities, Europe on the one side and on the other side Asia. I think the reasons why we do that are complex, and they've been explored by plenty of people, including me and some other venues. I don't want to explain that today. I want to talk about a way in which we might think of things differently and then see what happens when we do. Specifically, I'm talking about the possibility of considering historical China as a better paradigm of development, and to make the case that that we have to take our focus off of this conjuration of Europe and start with the problems of conceptualizing the history of the continent on which all these countries stand. It is a single continent, and that's been pointed out plenty of times without having much of an impact on the way we talk about history. I don't think that this continent is properly called Eurasia. We could call it anything, but I think the historical justification is for just calling it Asia. Asia has some subcontinents. Europe, South Asia, continental Southeast Asia, Kamchatka, and if you feel indulgent, Korea. I don't see a reason for appending a prefix to Asia that would elevate any of these subcontinents to the status of a continent. That doesn't mean that we know exactly where the perimeters of this Asia are. If we speak of an ecological Asia, it might look like this. This is the immediate zone of the home of the ancestors of its major domestic animals: aurochs, chickens, pigs, and though horses originated in North America, they took on the forms we know domestically in Asia and in Northeast Africa. But if we were to speak of historical Asia as an extended trade network, it might look like this. At the moment, I'm thinking, for various reasons, of the historical character of what we might call temperate Asia, which is roughly here. And this encompasses the early agricultural zones of Asia, the region in which technologies and languages have enjoyed the most rapid exchange. Jared Diamond has pointed out that this is also the region of the most frequent exchanges of genes and capacities for immunity. This Asia has contained about 70% of the human population over time, and that means it's been the scene of about 70% of human history. and it encompasses several very large areas of early agricultural development. My argument today is that in terms of the basic Asian patterns of development, the place to look for normative pattern is historical China. Why do we need a normative model? I would hope for the most part we don't, but we certainly do need some broadly relevant thresholds of chronology. And I'll also suggest a couple questions that the most common patterns of development of Asia can raise and maybe answer. Now, for all of Asia, why would China be exemplary of the most common trends? We can answer this partly by thinking about demographic development. I think we're past the point where anybody thinks that population growth in itself can cause anything to happen, whether that is urbanization or inhibition of technological progress or famine. Population growth and decline only mean something in relation to other conditions. So rising populations, for example, suggest to us the parallel developments in climate, technology, transportation, and development of markets necessary to sustain it. We usually associate Malthus with this anxiety about the tendency of a rising population to outstrip agricultural resources. But what Malthus really argued was that industrialization, emigration, and certain social changes would allow England to support a growing population even when the population was accelerating because of falling mortality rates. Today we measure it when we can in per capita income. If you're at the top of the per capita income tables, then your society has support for its population regardless of the size of the population. Some developmental analysts suggest that the demographic trends of early modern Britain and Netherlands were part of the cause of their so-called takeoff, their rapid increase in per capita income. It is certainly true that in the 17th and 18th century, the reproductive rates in England had a slowing rate of growth. But the real fall in population growth came after the Industrial Revolution was well underway. In any case, we see a pattern with a peak in the very early 19th century and then a continual drop to the present day. And remember, these are the rates of growth, not the size of the population itself. Here is the Western European population in absolute terms, alongside other societies. As you can see, the Western European trend lines is an exception. All the other trends show the general pattern of a rise in the 18th century, a steeper rise in the 19th century, and a very, very steep rise in the 20th century. Because China's numbers are higher in absolute terms, it rises above the other trend lines, but its general pattern resembles the rest of the world, while Western Europe's does not. There are some anomalies for China that we associate with extraordinary events, but in general, the China curve is the global curve. So in the modern world, China is the surviving political entity that's best suited to being representative of global trends. Its earliest agricultural centers in North China are still productive and they're still within its boundaries. This is a contrast to South Asia, for instance, where earliest agricultural center, which is still a zone of great population density, is divided between India and Pakistan. And it's also a contrast to Central America, where an early and still densely populated zone is divided among Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras. Equally important, China's in the temperate zone of Asia, so that it has continuously enjoyed the support of good temperatures, adequate water, and fertile soil to sustain and expand agriculture. And that's a real contrast to the Middle East, which has had several desiccating events in its climatological history. China has also been in a position to continuously enjoy contact with Central Asia, and by that means it's been in continual exchange of technological knowledge with the rest of the continent. And that is a contrast to parts of Southeast Asia, and parts of Europe in certain periods. Connected to that, China's 3,000 years of documented history have a perhaps optimal balance between periods of small and dispersed political centers, where local innovation and efficiency has thrived, and then periods of political unification under large empires, where innovations of the previous period could be disseminated in all directions. So as a result, over the centuries, China was both a recipient of technological knowledge, especially via Central Asia, and is a contributor of improvements and sometimes original knowledge and devices. So for these reasons, among, I guess, some others we could add, China as a society best exemplifies the fundamental trends of development across Asia. And this does not mean that if you took all the trends of Asian history and you averaged them out, you would you'd somehow have Chinese history. Far from that. It means that China is the society surviving today which best exemplifies Asian trends of development, or the trends experienced by the vast majority of humans. Its size in terms of spatial area, the diversity of its climates and terrains, the history of its agriculture, and the distribution of its population are among the factors that allow us to understand basic trends in Asian history, I mean in this continental sense, through the study of China's past. It is possible that the model is applicable beyond Asia. After all, the population of the zone that we associate with historical China has generally, so far as we know, been about 20% to 30% of the global population in the past 3,000 or 4,000 years. When China's population doubled in the 18th century, so did the world's. When China's population had tripled by the later 20th century, so had the world's. So whether we're talking about Ukraine or Austria, Thailand, Mexico, or Nigeria, areas with long agricultural histories, particularly if they're based on grains, and relatively stable political conditions, had historical rates of population growth that were consistent with China's in most periods. Now, how can we take this sort of basic observation and push it a little bit to make new distinctions in other trends and deviations? When we're talking about urbanization, historians often use this criterion of communities of 10,000 as a threshold for being urban. That's an important idea, and it creates a pattern of dense urbanization for, where else, Belgium and the Netherlands, particularly in the early modern period, and extremely low rates of urbanization for China and India in the same period. There is another way of looking at urbanization, and it's not in itself new, but this is considering urbanization as an index of the ability of the countryside to organize itself in such a way that food, materials, and people can be supplied to non-agricultural communities. If we wanted to understand that, we wouldn't set an absolute numerical threshold for an urban community. We'd have more of a sliding scale. That was a cat. I'm very interested in the work of the human population sociologist Reiko Hayashi at University of Tokyo. She is a specialist on Africa, and she wanted to find a way to use a certain kind of urbanization trend to reconstruct population figures for Africa before the colonial era. And she used this idea of the 10 largest concentrated non-agricultural spaces in a certain society to render a percentage that becomes a kind of ratio for being able to reconstruct population rates outside the cities. You may remember that William Skinner used a 2% finding for North China in the early 19th century in the introduction to the book City and Imperial China way back in 1977. Well, Hayashi has kind of taken that 2%, which she confirmed for China before 1900, China generally before 1900, and tested it for other agricultural societies before 1900, and found that 2% is just about the right figure. So China's right in line with that. Then she was able to do a reconstruction of the African population that, in fact, when she worked out the figures, she got to a population for Africa, let's say around the year 1600, that actually coincided with the observations of Europeans at that time who had gone to Africa and thought that the African population was probably equal to the population of Europe, that's the European subcontinent, around that time. And it does differ from the numbers found by the Angus Madison Project, who have the figures for Africa in that time at about 2/3 of the population of Europe, but they work it a different way. They try to find data. It's always kind of anecdotal data in the records. So what this suggests is that a China-derived Hayashi model, let's just call it that in quotes temporarily, for Asia shows that France, China, Nigeria, Japan, a long list of other countries are really in this one sort of standard profile. But there are places where something else is happening. Now, I'm going to say something speculative, because I haven't actually, and I wouldn't even know how, to go and do the kind of work that Hayashi has done for early modern temperate northwestern Europe and British North America. But I do believe that if you were to take not the 10,000 threshold, but the 10 top most populous places model, you would find that in this period Belgium was already on its way to the 100% urbanization that it has today, and England's top 10 spots were probably also at a rate much higher than 2%, let's say maybe 7 or 8%. And remember, if you use this 10,000 threshold, you would get in this period, the early modern period, well over half, maybe 60% of the English population would be, quote, urban. But you take the top 10 most populous places, I'm sure you'll get something very much out of line with the normal profile. Nothing surprising there. But I think you would also find that British North America probably had the highest rate of non-urban, non-agricultural to agricultural space with this top 10 place model. I think British North America would be way out of line with the places like these huge port cities of Philadelphia, maybe, absorbing as many as 9 or 10% of the population into the top 10 spaces. So if this were true, and I just feel looking over the statistics as you see them now, we'd have a kind of takeoff model with France and China on one side, and then England and Belgium and British North America on the other. And it might be a better predictor of what happened in the 19th and 20th century than models that are based on things like the Great Divergence or the Industrial Revolution. Now, again, using these macro issues to establish the value of a China-oriented paradigm of historical development as a way of understanding these deep structures in Asia, I want to do a little case study here. I warn you in advance, I'm going to be saying the word bureaucracy. I don't like that word, but as you know, this is a classic topic in Chinese history. And it's become so partly because of our assumption that China produced the earliest and most professional civil bureaucracy. And we believe that this bureaucracy has provided us with a great deal of close and reliable documentation about Chinese population and state finance. let's just think back to the graph that we saw before that was based on the Angus-Maddison estimates, and that showed this very remarkable and very consistent rise in China's population from about 1700 all the way to 1840. Now, that just happens to be the period in which William Skinner, who was hoping to make better estimates of China's losses in the Taiping War from 1850 to 1864. He looked at this period beforehand, and he found that officials had developed a habit of reporting a 2% rise in population at each census. It was impossible that this was the actual figure, but obviously it seems that careerist and political pressures to report such a figure were just overwhelming for a large number of bureaucrats. Personally, I have no doubt that China's population rose in the 18th century and rose very substantially. That's because I know, on the basis of other centuries, that China's population mirrors the global pattern, and globally the population was rising in the 18th century. But did it rise quite the way that the Angus-Maddison project thinks? Not necessarily. Now, lately, I've been thinking about an unrelated problem of bureaucracy. I've been doing some research on the civil governments of Han and Rome. Never mind why. If you read, or if you've written a global history lately, you always see a chapter comparing these two empires. And there are scholars, and I think most outstanding among them, Walter Scheidel, who make close comparisons of Rome and Han in terms of their economies and government structures. These two empires are eminently comparable, and that is primarily because the profound Asian trends in climate and agriculture and demography and iron technologies produce both of them. Their sizes are very similar. About 5 million square miles, that's a little under 2 million square miles for Rome, and about 6 million, that'd be about 2.3 million square miles for Han. Their populations have each been estimated at about 60 million, even though that's variable in each case. Their standing armies, each based primarily on infantry, have been estimated about 800,000 to 1 million men. They each had a capital with a population assumed to have been over 1 million people. And modern scholars estimate their daily per capita caloric intake to have been about the same, 2,100, 2,200 calories. More important, with respect to what I want to talk to you about now, is that their annual state revenues, which have been estimated by Walter Scheidel, were virtually the same. So it's very surprising that only our estimates of the size of their civil states are bizarrely and impossibly incompatible. And when I say the civil state, I mean something by what I refer to as the standing state. This is the cohort of full-time civil officials who've been salaried from and appointed by the central government. Specialists of Han history, who work mostly with the later Han, have proposed a total of 130,000 to 150,000 officials in any year between about 25 of the Common Era and 220 of the Common Era. And specialists of the Roman Empire have proposed a formula that would render only about 150 officials. Now that's a ratio of 1 to 1,000 for the size of the Roman and the Han states, which in all their material configurations are virtually the same. So something is wrong. Let's think about the Han case for a minute. The way we've been looking at this from the days of Homer Dubs, Hans Bielenstein, Etienne Balache, and the earlier career of Michael Lowy. We've looked at this as Han is typical of a Chinese history of extraordinary state and bureaucratic development. And from that point of view, there's nothing incredible about the Han Empire having a civil state that's more elaborate and better staffed than any contemporary. I don't think anybody said it would make sense for it to be 1,000 times bigger than the Roman state, but that it should be bigger than Rome, that's only to be expected. But once we think about China as being not an anomaly out on the fringes of development patterns, but virtually at the center of what we expect for Asian developments, then we have to ask some questions. Even without a comparison to Rome, you have to wonder at the implications of this figure of 150,000 officials. If there were 60 million people, then there's something less than 30 million men, but let's say there are 30 million anyway. And of those men, then maybe 15 million were between the ages of 15 and 60 and eligible for government service. What do we think the portion of the population was that had literacy sufficient to perform as a government official? If you think it was 1%, then the population eligible to serve as officials comes to just 150,000, the number that some Han specialists thought were serving. Are we really prepared to think that in Han China the population of highly literate men and the population of serving bureaucrats were precisely equal? I don't actually think that that is impossible. I could imagine a society of that period in which either by design or by some kind of overwhelming social dynamics, everybody serving in the government was literate and nobody outside the government was literate. We just have never described Han that way. So on these grounds alone, I'm finding these figures not so easy to believe. What are they based on? There's a passage in the Hohan Shul. This is one source. There's a passage in the Hohan Shul, and that's the imperial history of the Han, for the year 5 BCE, which states that from the prime minister down to the lowly Zorsher, these are transcribers, there were 120,285 men. When you look at the source, it's an orphan number. It just occurs in this passage that's describing the income ranks for officials. And there isn't any explanation for why this figure is stuck in there, and there aren't any categorically similar numbers in the source to just compare to it. I don't think we know exactly what it means. Bielenstein and others who are crediting these estimates today also find that a reference to the Imperial Academy, that's the Taixue, there's a reference to it admitting 30,000 students in a single year, and that seems to reinforce the notion of this huge Han bureaucracy. The Imperial Academy certainly supplied civil officials to the state. It also occasionally supplied officials to the military, and it is possible that it hosted already serving officials who had returned to the capital to rest or to get updated on the laws or to pursue their studies or to await transfers to another appointment. There isn't any reason to assume that all the students at the Imperial Academy would be freshly entering the bureaucracy after graduating. Moreover, when you look at the source, you see that it states that the Academy normally graduated a few hundred men who were prepared for office, and during the Wangmang interregnum, it's between 9 and 25 CE, the Han imperial government was suspended in favor of a kind of legalist-oriented regime, and the academy in that period boomed to a total of about 10,000 men, whom I think were clearly intended to displace gentry and loyalists of the Han dynasts. The source itself suggests that this 30,000, actually says more than 30,000. It suggests that this number, this more than 30,000, was an extraordinary occasion. In fact, it was the appointment of a new director. And it uses the term of various kinds to describe the group, and it says they're being transferred. So there's nothing to indicate that all or most of the students were headed for the civil service, or had not served before, and there's nothing to suggest anything normal about this occasion. So again, I do think it's unwise to look at these 30,000 transfers of students of various kinds on the occasion of a new director's appointment as evidence for huge numbers of men leaving the Imperial Academy each year to join the bureaucracy. Now, Lowry's estimates of 150,000 officials were not based on this kind of enigmatic anecdotal data, but on extrapolations from the Donghai Commandery in Shandong province. And we have a series of data for that commandery in the year 500 BCE. And if you assume that this is a totally normal commandery, you should be able to come up with a total number based on the total number of commanderies. This is a method, it's a perfectly straightforward method that's used by Roman historians to estimate the size of the armies. You happen to get some information on one legion, then you multiply that by 70 because there were 70 legions, and maybe it can work to estimate the number of Han officials in that year. But I'm thinking that there's another way to approach this, because once we think of China as exemplary of larger trends, we might be able to reason the other way from the larger picture in and find a kind of credibility test for some of this kind of disaggregated orphan data that is sometimes thrown up by the imperial histories. We know that the earlier Han state had doubled the roughly 50 commanderies of the Qin period, doubled them to about 100 in the very early Han period. But by the later Han, these have been kind of consolidated to 13 commanderies for the domestic area, and then there were a few more planted in Korea, Vietnam, and the transitional area to Central Asia. There was a civil official administering each commandery. So let's say for the early period, we've got 5,000 individuals serving in commandery offices, not just as the commanders. I mean, not just as the sort of governors of these, but the people under them. Let's say we've got 5,000 individuals in the early period, and for the later period, maybe 500 to 1,000. And then beneath this level of administration, there were a couple varieties of counties, in the Han period, we have over 1,800 of these, and of course, this number really doesn't fall by very much over the imperial period, all the way up to 1912. Han is higher than Ming, but only by a few hundred counties. These counties were drawn in relation to population. So you had a theoretical 10,000 people in each county. And so in North China, they were small and very numerous, and then in South China and Northwest China and Southern Manchuria, they were larger and much less numerous. It is reasonable to postulate, I think, perhaps 5 civil officials for all ranks in each county. And there were inspectors traveling among the counties and reporting back to the capital, so let's say there were 3,000 of them. That would total fewer than 20,000 civil officials outside the capital at any one time, maybe substantially fewer. If it had been the case, for instance, if we had 130,000 officials in total, and just going with these other estimates, if we had 130,000 officials in total and we have 60 million population, that would mean that about 1 in every 500 people was a government official, or 1 in 250 legal adults, or 1 in 125 men. Once again, we're kind of bumping up against the credible literacy rate, but we've also got this other problem of putting this 1 to 500 against the original Han ideal of 1 in 10,000. On the other hand, if there were about 12,000 officials and the rate of the of an official to the population, that'd be about 1 to 5,000. And if 3,000 of those were in the county magistracies, then that would be a ratio of 1 magistrate for 20,000 people. To me, that's very credible in relation to what the ideal, the original ideal was of 1 magistrate for 10,000 people. It just makes more sense to me than 1 in 500. These numbers are important because the figures of 130,000 to 150,000 Han officials have been accepted as unshakable, and they present this very bizarre contrast to Rome, where we have another unshakable number, and that is Keith Hopkins' famous estimate of 1 official per 350,000 to 400,000 people. As I said before, that would give us this ratio of like 1 to 1,000 for the sizes of the Roman and Han civil governments. That's problematic, even if Han had maintained its ratio, its ideal ratio of 1 official per 10,000 people. That would start us off right there, just in terms of theory, with a Rome to Han ratio of 1 to 35. And if we were to increase it by adding all kinds of local staff and governors and their staffs and a capital teeming with officials, we'd struggle to get to 1 to 100, and we'd never get to 1 to 1,000. So with comparable area, population, and duration, it's impossible that the Roman numbers could have been as small as the received estimates, or that Han could have been as large. It's not only that historians of China, what I mean to say is, it's not only for those of us who are studying China to have to adjust our paradigm of China being not an exception but more typical of Asian development. But historians of other empires would also have to take this into account in comparing their estimates of things like size of the civil government to what we find for China. Now, there are all kinds of ways of mitigating what seem to be clearly deficient Roman numbers. One of them is the definition of an official. The Roman system was notoriously top-heavy in comparison to Han. There was huge compensation for the people at the top of the rank tables, and as the compensation declines, so does the degree of documentation. So there's clearly a kind of invisible littoral to the Roman government system that nowadays we just don't see much in the document. These huge amounts that were spent each year by Rome on its officials couldn't have been absorbed by just a few hundred officials. In contrast, Han carefully limited the income of even its most high-ranking officials, but there was a priority on allowing governors and the provincial intendants and these county magistrates to have the resources they needed. So they would bring, I think, a lot of literate local support staff who were very poorly paid onto their roles. But I think the simplest way of reconciling these numbers is to assume that most of the ranks represented in the Han salary figures were not really for full-time, centrally appointed and centrally funded officers. In other words, the Han standing state did not consist of 120,000, 130,000, or 150,000 officials in any given year. If I had to guess, and this is a considered guess, but I would put it at maybe a maximum of 40,000 full-time officials, and then a good number of literate men who work part-time or on occasion as clerks. And mutatis mutandis, if I may, the silence of the Roman records on the number of centrally appointed and funded officials should lead us to hypothesize probably not less than 20,000 officials for them. we still see Han as an unusually large state, without being seen as impossibly out of proportion to contemporary empires of Asia. But what this suggests to me, moreover, is that both in the case of Han and in the case of Rome, we have empires that in their own time really drew a much less clear distinction between full-time professional officials and local men of talent who could be recruited for certain tasks, you know, big things happening like taking the census. They had small standing states, really. Rome's was very small. Han's was comparatively large, and they depended on locals to accomplish most tasks. Now, there's another way, again, taking this kind of normalization of China in stride. You can work another way. You know, if Han had really had 150,000 full-time civil officials, and it would have made Han this Leviathan compared to Rome's little tiny mouse, but it would also have made the Han government gigantic in comparison to subsequent states in China. So I think it's reasonable to credit the Sui and the Tang empires with a number of officials comparable to Han. So I'm going to say a maximum standing civil state of maybe 40,000. And for Song, I could go higher, maybe 50,000, because the evidence is that despite being smaller in size than Sui or Tang, Song had a larger population, a much higher GDP, and the resources to support a large centralized state. If it's true that about 30,000 men sat for the civil service examinations in the early dynastic period, that would be reasonable if you are assuming that the bureaucracy needed, say, 5,000 fresh officials a year. And this 400,000 candidates who are reported for sitting for the exams in the later years might only reflect increasing competition, not an increasing size of the bureaucracy. In fact, after 1234, it's reasonable to assume that the Song bureaucracy fell in size somewhat. But Song was the last large state in China before the 20th century. During the Yuan, Ming, and Qing periods, it's hard to justify estimates above 30,000 civil officials. In fact, for Yuan, it could have been much less than that. And the numbers, even for Qing, you know, could be somewhat smaller for that, somewhat smaller than that. In the Qing case, the empire was more than 3 times the size of Han, and the population was nearly 5 times as great. So while it is unreasonable to assume that Han had supported 150,000 civil officials and Qing only 30,000, it's not unreasonable to assume that Han supported as many as 50,000 civil officials and Qing only had 30,000. And the reason for this, I would say, again, relates to China's representativeness among the Asian empires. Now, these regions that had been ruled by formerly nomadic peoples, I mean, whether the Ottomans or the Mongol regimes across Asia, after 1200, in all those instances, the size of the central civil governments contracted sharply, and the government revenues were directed toward military affairs, and civil government functions that included tax collecting and road maintenance and some elements of peacekeeping and justice were privatized, and sometimes by letting them devolve to local aristocracy or landowners, and sometimes by contracting them out to private firms. The Ottoman Empire, for instance, had only a few hundred civil officials in its central office in the Divan, and maybe fewer than 5,000 officials distributed through the provinces. In post-Mongol Russia and in Iran, the bureaucracies remained small after the collapse of Mongol rule. And the same is true for Ming China, where many of the basic features of the Mongol administration, everything from the provincial structure to census taking, they were retained by the Ming. Timurid practices derived from the Mongols were spread to India in the 16th century from Central Asia. And this makes this general pattern of tiny civil governments stretched over huge imperial space with a comparatively well-endowed military infrastructure. That's the common one. And so Ming was representative in this sense of early modern Asia generally, late medieval, early modern, however we want to call that. Even in the Qing period, China's civil government size in relation to its society was still typical of the continent. Romanov Russia, because it had this very small government, Alexander had said 10,000 clerks, and because of its intention to preserve its small government, it privatized the colonization of the eastern frontier. And when you look at work, Dai Yingcong's study of Sichuan, for instance, you see that the Qing had also partly privatized the development of Sichuan and Tibet. So the typicality of that pattern and its consequences is evident when you look at the 19th century. Let's think about the 1890s, for instance. The nations whose educational and civil reforms and investments in agriculture, technology, and the military, particularly military industrialization, are indicated by these huge bureaucracies that they had. The nations like this are the ones that are bearing down on China and India and the Ottomans and even on Russia. And the leaders in these in this kind of group of aggressive states, you can call them the West, but why? Japan was the most critical of these expansionists, and its patterns of development most resembled those of Britain and North America. France, on the other hand, had basic patterns that long and most deeply resembled China, and by that I mean the French patterns resemble most of Asia. So what does stand out is that these nations were governed by bureaucracies that dwarfed those of most of the major continental empires. So we have these countries out sort of on the fringes of Asia, and I don't know if that's really a necessary part of the pattern, but that have this particular kind of development. They can organize their economies, and particularly extraction from the economy for the support of government, in such a way that they have these big bureaucracies that can initiate programs that we would consider to be associated with modernization. The American government in the late 19th century had 88,000 full-time centrally appointed officials. The British government had roughly the same number in the home government, not in the colonial administrations. And Meiji Japan had this large bureaucracy, partly because they were trying to accommodate the displaced samurai, but also they just had a lot of programs that they could actually employ these bureaucrats in. I do think France is really the most interesting case, because it not only resembled China in terms of its general development, but it had actually adapted institutions that it understood to be fundamental to the Ming bureaucracy, including the civil service examination. And as a matter of fact, its patterns of office holding seem to parallel China's as well, in the sense that early modern French officials regarded appointments as opportunities for enrichment. They had a small bureaucracy up to 1791, the Revolution, and up to 1789, the Revolution. And for 1791, 92, the French bureaucracy did become enormous. It was maybe 10 times the size it had been before the Revolution. But when you get into the 19th century, it's beginning to retract to a normal size of maybe around 20,000, and probably stayed there for most of the 19th century. So here's France, one of these imperializing, intrusive powers, not only in China, but more in Southeast Asia, And in this sense, you know, if we use China as a kind of reference point, you can really see how peculiar France's status was among Britain, Japan, the United States as an imperial force in East Asia. And that's been commented on before. Actually, Theda Skocpol made some very interesting comments about that. But it also shows you how fragile is this notion of the West or Europe or any of the comparative concepts derived from it. So this has just been an exercise in what history would look like, I mean, little parts of history would look like, if we took temperate Asia as a historical reference seriously. And within it, we set China's history of development as a referential paradigm. So things that didn't look strange before, like this supposed Han bureaucracy of 150,000 men, or France's evolution into an imperial power in the late 19th century, now do look a bit strange. And China's tiny and overmatched states of the early modern period look typical. I'm talking about the Ming and the Qing. They weren't unusually underfunded, unusually unprepared governments. They were typical of what most of Asia looked like in that period. The current fashion for discussing the divergence of Europe and non-Europe, making those comparisons all the time, Europe, non-Europe, I think it tends to prolong the life of these mirages, as I've called them, that have been inherited from the 19th and 20th centuries. And I believe that using China's developmental history as a revelatory of Asia, I mean the big Asia, will open up some new methods for explaining how we got from then to now. Cat.